You don't belong on this stage." The words sliced clean through the music, sharp enough to make even the lights feel colder. And for a second, everything, every laugh, every whisper, every shifting shadow across the polished floor, seemed to hesitate in place as if the room itself was deciding whether to breathe again. Marcus Reed stood center stage, one hand wrapped around a custom chrome microphone, the other gesturing lazily toward the girl at the edge of the spotlight. His expression calm, but edged with something quieter, something colder than confidence, the kind of certainty that came from years of being untouchable. And the crowd responded exactly the way he expected. Soft chuckles at first, then louder, phones lifting, screens glowing like a sea of small, hungry eyes waiting for something to happen. Ava Johnson didn't move right away, not because she hadn't heard him, but because the moment stretched too thin, pulled tight between what she knew and what everyone else had already decided about her. Her borrowed dress hanging just slightly loose at the shoulders, the fabric catching the light in a way that made it look more expensive than it was. Though up close the stitching told a different story, and somewhere behind the curtains, the faint smell of industrial cleaners still clung to her memory, sharp and familiar, reminding her that less than an hour ago, she had been wiping down the same stage she was now standing on, her hands steady then. Methodical, invisible, the spotlight shifted. Brighter now, pushing against her eyes, and Marcus tilted his head just slightly, like he was waiting for a reaction. Any reaction, something to confirm the story he had already written in his mind. "Go on," he added, voice smoother this time. Almost playful, but the room didn't miss the weight behind it, didn't miss the way security near the stage watched her a little too closely, or the way a producer off to the side folded his arms as if bracing for something awkward, something disposable. Ava stepped forward, one foot, then the other, the sound of her shoes soft against the stage, nearly swallowed by the low hum of the speakers, and for a brief moment, she caught her reflection in the black surface beneath her, a flicker of movement, a shadow trying to decide its shape. And then she reached the center, the microphone now in front of her, taller than she expected, colder too, the metal carrying the chill of the air conditioning that never quite reached the back hallways where she worked, and she lifted her hand, fingers brushing the stand just enough to steady it, just enough to steady herself. Her heartbeat loud but controlled, measured like something she had practiced without ever calling it practice. The crowd leaned in, anticipation building in uneven waves, some people already smiling, already ready to laugh, others watching with that quiet curiosity reserved for moments that could go either way, and Marcus took a half step back, giving her the space but not the power, never the power, his presence still filling the room like a weight pressing down from above. Ava inhaled slowly, the air cool against her throat, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again. And in that small movement, almost invisible to everyone else, something shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in her, a stillness replacing the hesitation, a quiet alignment of breath and memory, and something deeper than either. And for the first time since she stepped into the light, she wasn't looking at Marcus, or the crowd, or the cameras. She was looking somewhere just beyond them, somewhere steady, somewhere real, and the room, sensing it without understanding it, grew just a little quieter, the laughter fading into a thin edge of silence, stretched and waiting, like a held note that hadn't been sung yet. The silence did not break, it settled, heavy and deliberate, like the air before a storm that had not yet decided to arrive. And Ava Johnson stood there with her fingers still resting lightly on the microphone stand, her breathing slow, controlled, as if she had stepped into a space where time moved differently. And in that space, the noise of the crowd no longer reached her the same way. A few feet away, Marcus Reed watched with a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes, the kind of expression that suggested he had seen this moment 100 times before, hopeful amateurs stepping forward, thinking they had something special, only to fade under the weight of expectation, and behind him, a stagehand adjusted a cable, glancing up briefly before looking away again, already dismissing what was about to happen as something small, something forgettable. Ava lowered her gaze for just a second, not in submission, but in memory, and the stage lights above her blurred into something softer, something warmer, something that reminded her of narrow hallways lined with scuffed baseboards and flickering bulbs, the quiet rhythm of late nights when the building emptied out, and the only sound left was the distant hum of air vents and her own voice, barely louder than a whisper, filling the space with songs no one ever stayed to hear. She remembered the weight of the mop handle in her hands, the slow back and forth across polished floors, the way her mother used to tell her to keep her head down, to do the job right, to not draw attention, because attention was not always kind. And yet, even then, even in those quiet hours, Ava had never stopped singing, not for an audience, not for applause, but because something inside her refused to stay silent, something steady and persistent that did not ask for permission. The present returned in fragments, the faint buzz of a speaker, the distant click of someone zooming in on their phone camera, the low murmur of a voice somewhere in the front row whispering, "Is this part of the show?" And Ava lifted her head again, her eyes no longer searching the room, but moving past it, as if the crowd had become a background she no longer needed to understand. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, tapping the side of his microphone with a casual rhythm, waiting, always waiting, his confidence rooted in the certainty that nothing unexpected would happen here, not on his stage, not in front of his audience. And yet there was something in the stillness that lingered longer than it should have, something that did not fit the pattern he was used to, a pause that did not feel like hesitation, but like preparation. Ava adjusted the microphone by an inch, just enough to bring it closer, her hand steady now, the earlier tremor gone as if it had never been there. And she took another breath, deeper this time, the kind that filled her lungs completely, that settled into her chest and anchored her in place. And in that breath was everything she had carried with her into this moment, every quiet hallway, every unseen hour, every note she had held on to when no one else was listening. The room leaned in again, drawn not by spectacle, but by something quieter, something harder to name, and for a brief second, the lights seemed less harsh, the stage less overwhelming, as if the space itself was beginning to shift around her. And Marcus, watching more closely now, let his smile tighten just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to reveal that even he could feel it, that subtle change, that small but undeniable sense that this moment was not unfolding the way he had planned. And Ava, standing in the center of it all, finally parted her lips, not rushed, not forced, but with a calm that did not ask for approval, a calm that simply existed, waiting for the sound that would follow. The first note did not arrive with force, it arrived with precision, soft and clear, like a line drawn across glass that no one noticed until it caught the light. And for a fraction of a second the room did not react because it did not know how to react. The sound too clean to belong to the moment they had expected, too controlled to match the nervous girl they had already judged, and Ava Johnson held it there, steady, her voice not rising to impress, not pushing to prove, but settling into the space with a quiet confidence that felt older than her years. A man in the second row lowered his phone slightly, his brow tightening as if he needed to listen more carefully, while a group near the back stopped whispering mid-sentence, their laughter fading into something uncertain, and the speakers above carried her voice evenly, without distortion, without strain, filling the room in a way that felt natural, unforced, like it had always belonged there. Ava's hand remained on the stand, her fingers relaxed now, her posture no longer cautious but grounded, and as she moved into the next phrase, her tone deepened just slightly, adding weight without losing clarity, each note placed exactly where it needed to be, not rushed, not stretched, but understood. And somewhere behind the stage curtain, a technician paused with his headset halfway to his ear, his attention pulled forward despite himself. Marcus Reed did not move at first, but the shift was there, subtle and immediate, his shoulders tightening just enough to break the casual ease he had carried onto the stage. His eyes narrowing not in dismissal but in focus, because what he was hearing did not align with what he had planned, did not follow the script he had already written in his mind, and the faint smile that had lingered on his face began to thin, almost imperceptibly, as if it no longer had a reason to stay. Ava continued, her voice climbing now, not abruptly but with intention, each step upward supported, controlled, her breath steady beneath the sound, and the room responded without deciding to. A collective stillness forming, heavier than before, no longer waiting for a mistake, but recognizing something it had not expected to find, and the lights above her seemed less harsh now, reflecting off the polished floor in softer lines, framing her in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. A woman near the front leaned forward in her seat, her expression shifting from amusement to quiet concentration, while another person beside her slowly lowered their phone entirely, the need to capture the moment replaced by the need to experience it, and Ava, standing in the center of it all, did not look at any of them, her focus fixed somewhere beyond the edges of the room, somewhere internal and unwavering. Marcus shifted his stance, one foot sliding back slightly, the movement small but deliberate, his grip on his microphone tightening just enough to register, and for the first time since he had spoken, he did not interrupt, did not comment, did not guide the moment, because the moment was no longer his to control, and as Ava reached the end of the phrase, she did not pause for reaction, did not wait for approval. She moved forward into the next line with the same calm certainty, her voice rising higher now, not in defiance but in truth, and the room, caught between expectation and realization, leaned into the sound as it unfolded, unaware that the balance of the stage had already begun to change. Her voice did not rush to impress. It unfolded, deliberate and controlled, each note placed with the kind of precision that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And as Ava Johnson moved into the next line, the air in the room shifted again, tighter now, heavier, as if every person present had become aware of something they could no longer ignore. The pitch rose, clean and unwavering, climbing step by step into a range that felt just out of reach for most, but not for her, never. For her, and there was no strain in it, no visible effort, just a quiet mastery that revealed itself without explanation, and the speakers carried it across every corner of the venue, bouncing softly off glass panels and velvet seats, filling spaces that moments ago had been occupied by doubt. A man near the aisle straightened in his seat, his expression no longer amused but intent, while a woman 2 rows behind him pressed her hand lightly against her chest, as if the sound had settled there, as if it had weight. Marcus Reed's posture changed in increments so small they almost escaped notice. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his stance no longer casual, and his gaze fixed entirely on Ava now, not as a performer observing an amateur, but as someone trying to understand what he was hearing, trying to locate the edge of it, the flaw, the moment where it would falter, but that moment did not come. Ava lifted her chin just slightly as she transitioned into a higher register, her breath controlled, her tone brightening without losing depth, and the note that followed did not spike or waver. It held, steady and pure, extending just long enough to make the silence around it deepen, to make the absence of noise feel intentional rather than accidental. The crowd did not react immediately, not because they were unimpressed, but because they were adjusting, recalibrating what they thought they were witnessing. And in that recalibration, something shifted, the earlier laughter now distant, almost irrelevant, replaced by a quiet focus that bound the room together in a shared moment of realization. Backstage, a producer who had been scrolling through his phone lowered it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he listened more closely, while a lighting technician adjusted a dial, without looking away from the stage, the brightness softening just a fraction, as if even the lights were responding to her presence. Ava moved into the next phrase with the same calm certainty, her voice weaving between notes with a fluidity that suggested familiarity, not performance, and each transition carried a subtle emotional weight, not exaggerated, not forced, but real, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Marcus took a small step back, almost unconsciously, his grip tightening on the microphone at his side, and for the first time since the night began, he did not dominate the space. He reacted to it, his silence now different from before, no longer a setup for mockery, but a pause filled with something closer to recognition. Ava reached the peak of the passage, her voice lifting into a note that hovered at the edge of what most would attempt, let alone sustain, and she held it there, unwavering, the sound cutting clean through the room without force, without excess, just clarity. And in that clarity, the balance shifted completely, not with noise or applause, but with understanding, quiet and undeniable, settling over the crowd as they realized that the moment they had expected to laugh at had become something else entirely, something they could not interrupt, something they could only witness. The note did not end. It resolved, easing down with control so precise it felt intentional in every fraction of a second. And when Ava Johnson finally let it fall into silence, the absence of sound carried more weight than anything that had come before it. For a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and the room remained suspended in that fragile stillness where expectation had already been broken, but understanding had not fully settled yet. And then the smallest shift rippled through the crowd. A breath released here, a quiet exhale there, as if people were remembering how to react after forgetting what they had been prepared to see. Ava's hand remained steady on the microphone stand, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not searching for approval, not waiting for validation, but grounded in something internal that did not depend on the reaction in front of her. And the stage lights, once harsh and exposing, now seemed to frame her differently, softer at the edges, reflecting off the polished floor in a way that made the space feel less like a test and more like a moment that had found its rightful center. Marcus Reed did not speak, and that silence from him carried its own meaning, because he had always been the one to fill the space, to control the rhythm of the room, to decide when a moment began and when it ended. But now he stood slightly behind the line he had drawn for himself, his microphone lowered, his gaze fixed on Ava with a focus that was no longer dismissive, no longer certain, and the faint tension in his jaw suggested something unfamiliar, something he had not prepared for. A producer near the side of the stage leaned toward another crew member, whispering something too quiet to hear, but the tone had changed, no longer casual, no longer indifferent, and a camera operator adjusted their angle, zooming in not for spectacle, but for clarity, as if the frame needed to catch what had just happened before it slipped away. Ava shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not retreating, but simply resetting, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed, and when she began the next line, her voice returned without hesitation, softer this time, but no less controlled, carrying a different kind of strength, one that did not rely on volume or range but on presence, on the ability to hold the room without forcing it. The crowd responded in subtle ways, heads tilting, eyes narrowing in focus, the earlier anticipation of failure replaced by a growing awareness that they were witnessing something rare, something that did not announce itself loudly but revealed itself through consistency, through control, through truth. Marcus took a slow breath, the movement barely visible, and for a moment it seemed as though he might speak, might interrupt, might reclaim the space in the only way he knew how, but he did not, and that restraint, that pause, spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it acknowledged what was already clear, that the balance had shifted, that the stage no longer belonged to him in the way it had before. Ava's voice rose again, not as high as before, but with a richness that filled the room differently, warmer, more grounded, and each note carried a quiet confidence that did not ask to be compared, did not seek to prove anything, but simply existed as it was, undeniable and complete. And in that unfolding, the tension that had once been directed at her transformed into something else entirely, something closer to respect, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The silence between phrases grew heavier, not with doubt, but with attention. Every pause intentional, every breath part of the rhythm. And as the moment continued, it became clear that this was no longer about a test or a challenge, no longer about proving someone wrong, but about revealing something that had always been there, something that could not be dismissed once it had been heard. And Marcus, standing just a step behind, remained still, his presence no longer dominating but witnessing, as the reality of the moment settled in around him with quiet, undeniable weight. The room did not return to noise. It deepened into a quieter kind of attention, the kind that settled into the spaces between breaths and lingered there. And Ava Johnson stood within it, as if she had always known it would come, her voice easing into the next passage with a softness that felt deliberate, almost intimate, yet still carried to the far edges of the venue without effort. The sound no longer needed to prove anything. It simply existed, steady and assured, and in that assurance there was a different kind of power, one that did not demand recognition but received it anyway, and the audience responded in ways they did not fully understand, their movements smaller now, their focus sharper, as if the moment had drawn a boundary around itself that no one wanted to break. Ava's eyes remained forward, not fixed on any single person but anchored somewhere beyond the lights. Her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed, and the slight rise and fall of her chest became part of the rhythm, part of the performance that did not feel like a performance at all, and each phrase she sang seemed to settle into the room like something familiar, something that had always belonged there, but had only just been heard. Marcus Reed shifted again, the movement subtle but unmistakable, his stance no longer aligned with the center of the stage but just off to the side, his presence receding in a way that contrasted sharply with how the night had begun, and his microphone remained lowered and used, as if he understood that any interruption would fracture something that had already taken shape. A woman near the front wiped at the corner of her eye without realizing it, her attention fixed entirely on Ava, while a man a few seats over leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet respect that showed in the stillness of his posture. The lighting above seemed to soften further, casting a warmer tone across the stage, and the reflections on the floor shifted with it, less harsh, more fluid, as if the environment itself was adjusting to the presence it now held. Ava moved into a lower register, her voice rich and steady, carrying a depth that balanced the clarity she had shown before, and the transition felt seamless, like a conversation rather than a display, like something shared rather than performed. And in that shift, the room followed her, drawn into the cadence of her breathing, the subtle pauses, the controlled release of each note. Marcus's gaze did not leave her, and there was no trace of dismissal left in it now. Only focus. Only the quiet acknowledgement that what he was witnessing existed outside the expectations he had brought with him. And for a moment, he seemed to consider stepping forward, reclaiming the space. But the thought passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by a stillness that mirrored the audience around him. Ava reached the end of the phrase and allowed the final note to fade naturally, not cutting it short, not extending it beyond what it needed to be. And in that restraint there was a confidence that did not seek to impress, only to be true, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the resonance of what had just been heard, filled with the understanding that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. No one rushed to react, no one broke the moment with applause or commentary, because the moment itself had become something fragile, incomplete, something that asked only to be held for a little longer, and Ava, standing in the center of it, did not move, did not look around. She simply remained, grounded and present, as the quiet settled deeper around her, and the weight of what had changed began to take its place in every corner of the room. The silence held for a fraction longer than expected, and then it shifted, not with noise, but with understanding, a quiet recognition moving through the room like a slow current, and Ava Johnson stood at the center of it, her hand still resting lightly on the microphone stand, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if the moment unfolding around her was not something she needed to control, only something she needed to remain present within. Marcus Reed did not move at first, but the stillness around him pressed differently now, no longer supportive, no longer aligned with him, and the weight of the room had shifted away from his presence and settled somewhere else entirely, somewhere he could not reach without acknowledging it. And that realization lingered in the way his shoulders lowered slightly, in the way his grip on the microphone loosened just enough to show that the certainty he carried onto the stage had begun to fracture. Ava lifted her gaze just slightly, not toward him, not toward the crowd, but forward, as if the space ahead of her had opened into something clearer. And when she began the final passage, her voice did not rise to dominate. It refined itself, narrowing into something sharper, more focused, each note placed with an exactness that made it impossible to ignore. And as the melody climbed again, higher than before, the precision remained unwavering, the tone pure and controlled in a way that did not rely on force but on mastery. A quiet intake of breath moved through the audience, subtle but collective, as the sound reached a range that most voices would approach with caution, if at all, and Ava held it there, not pushing beyond its limit, not straining to extend it, but settling into it with complete control, as if the note itself belonged to her, as if it had always been waiting for her to claim it. Marcus's eyes followed the sound, not with disbelief, but with something deeper, something closer to recognition, because he understood what it took to reach that level. He understood the discipline behind it, the years behind it. And in that understanding came the quiet realization that this was not a moment of chance, not a fluke, not an accident shaped by the stage, but something real, something earned, something that stood independent of everything he had assumed. The room remained still, no longer waiting for the end, no longer anticipating a shift, but absorbing what was already happening, and Ava, holding the final note with calm precision, allowed it to resolve slowly, easing it down without breaking its clarity, guiding it into silence with the same control she had shown from the beginning. And when the sound finally disappeared, it left behind a presence that did not fade with it. Marcus lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, not in embarrassment, but in acknowledgement, the kind that did not require words. And when he looked up again, the stage no longer belonged to him in the way it once had, because the moment had revealed something beyond status, beyond expectation, something that could not be dismissed once it had been heard. Ava released the microphone stand, her hand falling naturally to her side, and she did not wait, did not look for approval, did not search the faces in front of her for validation, because the truth of the moment had already been established, not through reaction, but through sound, through control, through presence. And as she took a single step back, the balance of the room remained where it had shifted, quiet and undeniable, resting with her. The silence did not shatter, it unfolded, slowly giving way to a sound that felt almost uncertain at first, a single clap from somewhere near the center, followed by another, and then another, until the room began to respond in waves, not explosive, not chaotic, but rising with a kind of restrained intensity that carried more weight than any sudden burst of noise. And Ava Johnson remained still as it built around her, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if the reaction was something happening outside of her rather than something she needed to receive. The applause grew, filling the space with a rhythm that echoed off the walls and settled into the floor beneath her feet. And yet it did not overwhelm the moment that had come before it. It followed it, shaped by the understanding that had already taken root in the room. Marcus Reed stood just behind her, the distance between them small in space but vast in meaning now, and he looked at her with a focus that had lost its earlier edge, replaced instead by something quieter, something more deliberate, and for a brief second, it seemed as though he might step forward and reclaim the center, might say something that would restore the balance he was used to, but he did not move, not yet. Ava turned slightly, not toward the audience, but toward the edge of the stage, her hand brushing lightly against the side of the microphone stand as she stepped away from it, her movements unhurried, unforced, and the applause continued, following her as she shifted position, not chasing her, not demanding more, but acknowledging what had already been given. A producer near the wings leaned forward, speaking quickly into a headset now, his earlier detachment gone, replaced by urgency, while a camera operator adjusted focus again, tracking Ava's movement with a steadiness that suggested this was no longer just part of the program. This was something worth capturing completely. Marcus finally took a step forward, the movement measured, his presence re-entering the center of the stage but not dominating it, and he raised his microphone slowly, not to interrupt, not to reclaim control, but to speak into the space that had changed around him. And when he did, his voice carried a different tone than before, still confident, still clear, but stripped of the sharp edge that had defined it earlier. "Stay right there," he said, not as a command, not as a test, but as a request, and the room quieted again, not out of expectation, but out of attention. Ava paused, her back partially turned, and then she stopped completely, her posture still composed, her expression calm as she faced slightly away from him, not retreating, not advancing, simply holding her place. Marcus lowered his gaze for a brief moment before looking back up, and in that small motion there was a shift that did not need explanation, a recognition of something he could not dismiss, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before turning slightly toward the audience. The applause softened, settling into a quieter presence as the room waited, not for spectacle, but for clarity, and Ava remained where she was, not seeking the spotlight. Again, not stepping into it further, but standing just at its edge, grounded and steady, as the moment moved beyond performance into something else, something that no longer needed to prove anything, something that had already spoken for itself. The room held its breath again, not out of tension this time, but out of respect, a quiet understanding settling over every seat, every shadow, every flicker of light reflecting off the polished stage, and Ava Johnson stood at the edge of that light, still and grounded, her presence no longer questioned, no longer measured against anything but itself. Marcus Reed remained near center stage, the microphone in his hand no longer a symbol of control, but simply a tool, and when he finally spoke, again, his voice carried without force, without performance. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, unembellished, yet unmistakably directed toward her, and in that moment, the room shifted once more, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. Ava did not turn immediately, did not rush to respond, because the moment did not ask for it. And when she did glance back, it was brief, steady, her expression unchanged, not seeking approval, not offering triumph, only acknowledging what had already been said without words. The applause began again, softer at first, then fuller, not erupting, not overwhelming, but steady and sustained, the kind that carried weight rather than volume. And people rose slowly, one by one, not out of obligation, but because remaining seated no longer felt appropriate, because something genuine had taken place and demanded to be recognized. Ava stepped back. From the edge of the spotlight, her movements calm, unhurried, and as she walked toward the side of the stage, the light followed her for a moment before settling back into its original position, leaving her partially in shadow, not hidden, but no longer the center, and she did not look back again, did not pause to absorb the reaction, because the moment she had created did not need to be extended. It had already completed itself. Marcus lowered his microphone slightly, watching her go, not with regret, not with loss, but with a quiet awareness that something had changed beyond the boundaries of the stage, something that would remain long after the lights dimmed and the audience dispersed, and for a brief second, he stood without speaking, allowing the sound of the room to exist without shaping it, allowing the applause to carry its own meaning. Backstage, a stagehand stepped aside to clear her path, offering a small nod that she returned with the slightest incline of her head, a silent exchange that required no acknowledgement beyond itself. And as Ava moved past the curtain, the noise of the room softened behind her, replaced by the quieter sounds of the hallway, the distant hum of equipment, the faint echo of voices that did not reach her fully. The stage remained lit, the audience still standing, but the center of the moment had already moved, no longer confined to the spotlight, no longer defined by who controlled the microphone, and Marcus, standing alone now in that light, did not attempt to reclaim it, did not fill the space with explanation or commentary, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to frame. The final image lingered in stillness, the empty space where Ava had stood, the light reflecting off the floor in soft, quiet lines, and the sound of applause gradually easing into silence, not abrupt, not forced, but natural, like a breath released at the end of something complete. And in that silence, the truth of what had happened remained, steady and undeniable, long after the moment itself had passed.